Summer, 1944. Belarusian forests. The German command receives sensational information. 2,000 of their soldiers have survived the encirclement and continue to fight. For 9 months, Berlin supplied this unit with weapons and food and sent in agents. 39 aircraft sorties, 22 reconnaissance missions, millions of rubles. But there was one problem. This unit never existed. It was all a grand hoax by Soviet intelligence, which went down in history under the codename Operation Berezino. How did they manage to deceive German intelligence? Who was the main character in this incredible game? And why did the Germans believe in a non-existent army? Today we reveal one of the most daring operations of the Great Patriotic War. If you are interested in the history of such incredible operations, where victory was achieved not by force of arms, but by force of mind, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Here you will find many more exciting stories about secret operations of special services, about heroes whose names remained classified for many years, about events that changed the course of the war. Now, here's a question for discussion in the comments. Do you think such a long and complex operation was justified in order to divert enemy resources? Or could Soviet intelligence have used these forces more effectively? Write your opinion. It's interesting to hear different points of view. See you in the next episodes. The summer of 1944 was a turning point in the Great Patriotic War. On June 23, the Red Army launched a massive offensive operation codenamed Bagration. The goal was ambitious: the complete liberation of Belarus from the German fascist invaders. 4 fronts simultaneously launched an attack on the positions of Army Group Center. In a few weeks, Soviet troops advanced westward a distance of 500 to 600 kilometers. The German defenses were breached along a front stretching 1,100 kilometers. The Wehrmacht suffered colossal losses. About 400,000 soldiers and officers were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. It was a catastrophe on the scale of the Battle of Stalingrad, only this time it unfolded on Belarusian soil. In the chaos of the rapid advance, dozens of German units found themselves cut off from the main forces. The surrounded units tried to break through to their own lines, but most of them faced certain death or capture. The Soviet command methodically cleared the encircled pockets, leaving the enemy no chance of escape. However, it was this situation that gave Soviet intelligence a unique opportunity. Moscow closely monitored developments and looked for ways to take maximum advantage of the situation. What if the encirclement of German troops could be used for large-scale disinformation of the enemy? The idea came from the very top. On the eve of Operation Berezino, Joseph Stalin summoned 3 key figures from the Soviet Special Services to his office: Kuznetsov, head of the General Staff's Intelligence Directorate; Abakumov, head of the Smersh Military Counterintelligence Service; and Pavel Anatolievich Sudoplatov, representative of the NKVD, gathered in the Kremlin office of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. Stalin approved the successful work on Operation Monastery, which had been ongoing since 1941. This radio game with German intelligence had already yielded tremendous results, allowing the enemy to be misinformed before the Battle of Stalingrad. Now the Supreme Commander proposed a new, even more daring concept. The plan was ingenious in its simplicity, and at the same time incredibly difficult to execute. It was necessary to create the impression among the German command that a large German unit had been surrounded in the rear of the rapidly advancing Red Army. This unit had to appear completely real, with a specific commander, exact numbers, and a specific location. Moreover, these surrounded German soldiers had to demonstrate steadfastness, loyalty to their oath, and a willingness to fight to the last. Such a legend could force the enemy to spend precious resources to support a non-existent unit. But most importantly, it could distract the German command from the real directions of the Soviet troops' attacks. Stalin understood the psychology of the enemy. The German war machine was built on strict discipline and a cult of loyalty. The idea that somewhere in the Belarusian forests, an encircled German unit was fighting and surviving was bound to resonate with German generals. It corresponded to their ideas of duty and honor. Goebbels' propaganda could use such a story to boost the morale of the troops. This meant that the German command would certainly try to help its heroes. The only question was how large-scale and convincing the deception would be. Would Soviet intelligence be able to mislead the enemy so that the game would continue not for days or weeks, but for months? The operation was codenamed Berezino, after the name of the river in the area where the fictitious German unit was supposed to be located. This name was not chosen by chance. Berezino had tragic significance in history. It was here in 1812 that Napoleon's army suffered a catastrophic defeat while retreating from Russia. Now this place was to become the scene of a new grand deception. Only this time the victim was the Wehrmacht. The symbolism was obvious to everyone involved in the operation. History seemed to be repeating itself, but this time using the latest intelligence methods. Radio communications, agent networks, and carefully staged legends. The most experienced specialists of the Soviet Special Services were entrusted with leading the operation. Pavel Anatolievich Sudoplatov, who headed the 4th Directorate of the NKVD, responsible for sabotage, became the chief coordinator. This man already had many successful operations to his credit. In 1938, he organized the liquidation of Yevgeny Konovalets, leader of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. In 1940, he led the preparation of the assassination attempt on Leon Trotsky in Mexico. Sudoplatov possessed a cold, analytical mind, the ability to calculate the enemy's actions many moves ahead, and nerves of steel. He was exactly the kind of person needed for an operation of this scale. Sudoplatov's deputy and the immediate supervisor of the operation on the ground was Naum Isakovich Eitingon, a legendary intelligence officer, participant in the Spanish Civil War, and organizer of Trotsky's assassination. Eitingon was a master of clandestine work. He knew how to create multi-step combinations, recruit agents, and manage complex operations in conditions of absolute secrecy. Berezino required not just deceiving the enemy with one-off disinformation, but building a long-term radio game with many participants and constantly changing circumstances. Eitingon was just the man for the job, but even he faced unprecedented challenges. The team of developers and executors of the operation included the best specialists. Mikhail Makliarsky, who, according to some sources, came up with the initial idea for the operation, became one of its key participants. This officer had a talent for screenwriting. He knew how to create convincing legends and think through every detail. After the war, Makliarsky did indeed become a famous screenwriter. But for the time being, his creativity was focused on creating a realistic war drama for German intelligence. Georgy Mordvinov, Yakov Serebryansky, Grigory Zobak. Each of these men was a professional of the highest caliber, and the work of the radio operators was supervised by a man who was destined to go down in history as Rudolf Abel, William Fisher. Thus began the preparations for one of the most ambitious hoaxes in the history of the Secret Services. Soviet intelligence was preparing to create an entire fictitious army and make the German command believe in its existence. Would this daring plan succeed? Would the Germans believe in the legend of the surrounded heroes? And at what cost would this victory on the invisible front of the intelligence war come? Creating a fictitious military unit required careful preparation and flawless execution. It was not enough to simply convey information to the Germans about the existence of an encircled unit and expect them to believe it. A convincing legend was needed, real people capable of playing their roles, reliable radio communication, and, most importantly, constant control over the development of the situation. The slightest mistake could lead to the failure of the entire operation. Despite its defeats on the front, German intelligence remained a professional and dangerous adversary. The Abwehr and other German special services had their own methods of verifying information, their own agents, and their own channels of communication. It was extremely difficult to deceive them. The first and most important element of the operation was the selection of a person to play the role of commander of the surrounded German unit. They needed a real German officer of the appropriate rank, with combat experience, knowledgeable in military affairs, and able to communicate convincingly with the German command. At the same time, he had to agree to work for Soviet intelligence. Finding such a person among tens of thousands of prisoners of war was no easy task. But the Soviet Special Services had a huge database of captured German soldiers. Each prisoner was interrogated, and his biography, political views, and psychological profile were studied. This is how a suitable candidate was found. He was Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich Scherhorn. This career Wehrmacht officer was captured near Minsk in July 1944 during Operation Berezino. Scherhorn was about 40 years old, had extensive military experience, and was considered a competent commander. Unlike many fanatical Nazis, Scherhorn was a pragmatic man. By the summer of 1944, Germany's defeat in the war was becoming increasingly obvious, even to the most stubborn optimists. Soviet troops were advancing inexorably. The Allies had landed in Normandy, and the Third Reich was falling apart at the seams. In such conditions, many German military personnel began to think about survival rather than victory. NKVD officers held a series of talks with Scherhorn. They explained the real situation on the front lines, showed him data on Wehrmacht losses, and told him about the inevitability of Germany's defeat. Then they offered him a choice: remain a regular prisoner of war with an uncertain fate, or agree to cooperate with Soviet intelligence. In return, they guaranteed him his life, relatively comfortable conditions, and the opportunity to return to Germany after the war. Scherhorn agreed. Perhaps he truly understood the futility of further resistance. Perhaps he simply wanted to survive. His motives were irrelevant. What mattered was that he was ready to play the role assigned to him, and to play it convincingly. In addition to Scherhorn, other German prisoners of war who agreed to cooperate were also included in the fictitious unit. Among them were Willy Eckart and Hans-Johann Michaelis, experienced soldiers who knew military affairs. Some of these people were staunch anti-fascists, while others were simply tired of the war and wanted to survive. Each of them was explained their role in the operation, briefed, and given cover stories. They were to portray members of the surrounded unit, talk about their difficulties, needs, and battles with Soviet troops. At the same time, their every word was controlled by Soviet supervisors. The slightest deviation from the script was unacceptable. To ensure the security of the operation, Scherhorn's group was assigned 20 machine gunners from the separate motorized rifle brigade for special assignments, OMSBON. This was an elite NKVD unit created for sabotage and reconnaissance work. OMSBON fighters underwent special training and were known for their high discipline and reliability. They were commanded by Major Borisov, an experienced Special Forces officer. The machine gunners were not only responsible for protecting the task force, but also, if necessary, for impersonating German soldiers, creating the appearance of a real military unit. In addition, they controlled all German prisoners of war who were part of the fictitious unit, preventing them from betraying the mission. Particular attention was paid to the organization of radio communications. The entire operation was based on a radio game, the exchange of messages between the supposedly surrounded German unit and the Wehrmacht command. William Fischer was entrusted with leading this critically important part of the operation. This man would go down in the history of world intelligence as Colonel Rudolf Ivanovich Abel, who in 1957 would be arrested in the United States and become the hero of one of the most sensational spy scandals of the Cold War. But in the summer of 1944, he was simply a brilliant radio operator and intelligence officer. a master of his craft. Fischer was responsible for all technical aspects of radio communications. It was necessary to tune the radio stations to the required frequencies, ensure the smooth operation of the equipment, and organize the encryption and decryption of messages. But most importantly, it was necessary to imitate the characteristic style of German radio operators. Each radio operator has their own individual style of transmitting signals, recognizable to experienced operators. This is called the radio operator's style. German radio intelligence could detect a fake by incorrect style. Therefore, Fischer and his colleagues studied the peculiarities of German radio operators' work, trained to imitate their manner, and achieved absolute authenticity in their transmissions. It was precision work that required technical skill and attention to the smallest details. The location for the task force was chosen with great care. They settled on the area around Lake Piasecznoe in Belarus, not far from the town of Berezino. This area was ideal for the legend. The dense forests provided cover, the swamps made it difficult for Soviet troops to move around, and the remoteness from large population centers made the existence of a lost German unit there plausible. Moreover, the very fact that some German units had indeed been surrounded and destroyed in this area during Operation Berezino added credibility to the legend. The German command knew that units cut off from the main forces remained in those areas. This meant that the information about Scherhorn seemed quite reliable. However, the location of the task force required serious security measures. Operation Berezino was carried out in the strictest secrecy. Even many high-ranking Soviet military and party leaders did not know about it. Keeping the secret was so important that even the People's Commissar of State Security of Belarus, Sana, was not privy to the details of the operation. When he received reports of the appearance of an unknown military unit with German prisoners of war in the Belarusian forests, he mistook it for enemy saboteurs and almost organized an operation against it. Only the urgent intervention of Moscow prevented a catastrophe. This incident showed how important secrecy was and how difficult it was to maintain it in wartime. Additional measures were taken to protect the area where Scherhorn's fictitious unit was located. The approaches to Lake Piasecznoe were carefully guarded by military patrols. Anti-aircraft and machine gun installations were camouflaged on the approaches, in case the Germans attempted to establish visual contact with their surrounded unit. Any outsiders who happened to be in the vicinity were immediately detained. An entire security system was created to ensure complete isolation of the area of operations from the outside world. All this required significant resources and coordination between various services, but the result was worth it. The Germans were not to receive any information about what was happening, except for what was transmitted to them by radio. Now all that remained was to start the game itself. All the participants were prepared, all the technical equipment was set up, and all security measures were taken. All that remained was to set the deception in motion, and hope that the German command would take the bait. But for this, a reliable channel of communication with the Germans was needed, a channel that they completely trusted. And such a channel existed. It was embodied by a man named Alexander Demyanov, known to German intelligence under the codenames Heine, and later Max. It was through him that Operation Berezino was to begin. But who was this man, and why did the Germans trust him so much? Heinrich Scherhorn was born in 1904 in Germany, into a family of career military personnel. From his youth, he was prepared for a military career, which was quite natural given his background and the times. After Hitler came to power in 1933, the German army began to expand rapidly, and young officers had broad prospects for career growth. Scherhorn served conscientiously, was promoted to lieutenant colonel, and commanded various units. He was not a fanatical Nazi, but he did not oppose the regime either. He was an ordinary professional soldier doing his duty. By the summer of 1944, Scherhorn was serving in Army Group Center on the Soviet-German front. His unit took part in defensive battles in Belarus, trying to hold back the powerful Soviet offensive. But it was impossible to withstand the blow of 4 Soviet fronts. The German defense collapsed, and the chaos of retreat began. Many units were surrounded. Scherhorn's unit also fell into the cauldron. After several days of fighting, deprived of supplies and communication with the command, the remnants of his unit were forced to surrender. Thus, Lieutenant Colonel Scherhorn became a prisoner of war. At first, he was taken to one of the front-line camps for prisoners of war, where he was initially interrogated. SMERSH and NKVD officers regularly visited such camps in search of people of interest. Scherhorn immediately attracted attention. A lieutenant colonel, unit commander, and experienced man, he was a potentially valuable source of information. He was transferred to a special facility, where he underwent a series of in-depth interviews. The interrogators quickly realized that they were not dealing with an ideological Nazi, but a pragmatic military professional. Scherhorn willingly answered questions about the deployment of German troops, their numbers, and their weapons. He understood that the war was lost and saw no point in stubbornness. Gradually, the conversations with him shifted to another topic. The NKVD officers began to test the waters. Was Scherhorn ready for closer cooperation? The lieutenant colonel was shown data on the situation at the front, the Allied landings in Normandy, and the bombing of German cities. They explained to him that Germany was doomed to defeat, that it was only a matter of months. Then came the proposal. Scherhorn did not need to betray his former comrades or switch sides to the USSR in an ideological sense. Only one thing was required of him: to play a certain role in a special operation. In return, he was guaranteed his life, normal conditions of detention, and a return to his homeland after the war. Scherhorn did not think long. The alternative was unenviable: to remain an ordinary prisoner of war, possibly spending years in a camp, possibly not surviving captivity at all. The mortality statistics among prisoners on the Eastern Front were horrific on both sides. Here, he was being offered a relatively safe option. He would not have to betray specific people or take part in combat operations against his own side. He would simply have to play a role. He agreed. This decision determined his fate for the next year and saved his life. Many of his fellow prisoners did not live to see the end of the war. After Scherhorn agreed, he began thorough preparation for his upcoming role. Specialists worked with him, explaining the details of the operation and rehearsing possible situations. Scherhorn had to memorize the legend of his unit, how it had become surrounded, what route it had taken, its composition and armament, and where it was located. All of this had to look completely plausible. Any inconsistency in the details could arouse the suspicion of German intelligence. Scherhorn was given information about real German units operating in those areas, and about the battles that took place there. His cover story had to fit organically into the real picture of events. Particular attention was paid to psychological preparation. Scherhorn had to behave like a real commander of a surrounded unit, demonstrating steadfastness, composure, and concern for his men, while at the same time realistically assessing the difficulties of the situation. He should not appear too panicked or overly confident. Balance was critically important. The German command had to believe that their lieutenant colonel was in a difficult situation, but was holding up well and deserved help. At the same time, Scherhorn had to regularly report on his needs, the lack of food, medicine, and ammunition. This was necessary in order to lure as many resources as possible from the Germans. Along with Scherhorn, other participants in the operation were also prepared from among the prisoners of war. Each was assigned a role. Some had to portray officers from Scherhorn's staff, some radio operators, and some ordinary soldiers. Some of these people were staunch opponents of the Nazi regime and willingly agreed to help Soviet intelligence. Others were motivated by profit and survival. There were also those who were simply tired of the war and wanted it to end as soon as possible. Their motives varied, but they all understood that there was no turning back. The slightest betrayal would mean death not only for themselves, but also the failure of the entire operation. and they were being watched by Omsbahn machine gunners, who would not give them a chance to escape or sabotage. Scherhorn was told that his role would not be limited to simple radio communications. German liaison officers, and radio operators might be sent to him. He would have to communicate with them, convince them of the reality of the situation, and maintain the cover story. This required acting skills and a cool head. Any mistake could cost lives. But Scherhorn was ready. He had military experience, leadership skills, and, most importantly, a strong instinct for self-preservation. He understood the rules of the game and was ready to play by them. Moreover, the Soviet curators promised him not only survival, but also certain privileges: normal food, housing, and even the opportunity to return to Germany after the war. In late July, early August 1944, Scherhorn and a group of German prisoners of war who agreed to participate in the operation, together with a task force of Soviet intelligence officers and Omsbahn machine gunners, were secretly transported to the area of Lake Pisachno. There, a camp was set up, disguised as a parking lot for the surrounded German unit. Tents were erected, radio equipment was deployed, and guards were posted. Everything was ready for the operation to begin. All that remained was to wait for the signal. This signal was to be given by a man in a completely different location, Agent Gaina, the legendary Soviet intelligence officer, Alexander Demyanov. Only through him could the Germans learn of the existence of Scherhorn's unit. But how did a Soviet agent end up in such a trusting relationship with German intelligence? This story began back in 1941, when Operation Monastery, the predecessor to Berezino, was launched. It was the success of that operation that made Berezino possible. Without Heine, nothing would have worked out. But who was this man? Alexander Petrovich Demyanov was born in 1913 in Moscow, into an intellectual family. His father was an engineer, his mother a teacher. Alexander received a good education, spoke German, and was an athletic and sociable young man. In the 1930s, during the era of mass repression, his family miraculously escaped arrest, although many of their acquaintances suffered. Perhaps this is what prompted Demyanov to look for ways to protect himself and his loved ones. Or perhaps he was a true patriot and ideological supporter of Soviet power. The exact motives for his actions remain a subject of debate among historians. But the fact remains that in the late 1930s, Demyanov was recruited by Soviet intelligence. His handlers quickly assessed his potential. Demyanov was educated, charming, fluent in German, and had a wide circle of acquaintances in Moscow's intellectual circles. Among his acquaintances were people with questionable political views and potential agents of foreign intelligence services. It was through these connections that Demyanov was to gain the trust of German intelligence. The plan was simple in theory, but difficult to execute. Demyanov was supposed to portray himself as a person dissatisfied with Soviet power and willing to cooperate with the Germans. At the same time, he remained a Soviet agent, carrying out an assignment for the NKVD. Double-dealing is one of the most dangerous forms of intelligence work. In 1940, shortly before the start of the war, Demyanov established contact with German intelligence agents operating in Moscow through his acquaintances. He cautiously hinted that he was disappointed with the Soviet system, that he considered Stalin's regime criminal, and that he was ready to help Germany. The Germans were interested. Demyanov was of considerable value to them. A Muscovite, educated, with good connections, and fluent in German. Such agents were worth their weight in gold. Cautious meetings, conversations, and checks began. German intelligence was professional and did not trust random volunteers. Demyanov had to prove his sincerity. When the war began on June 22, 1941, Demyanov had already been recruited by German intelligence. He was given the code name Max, later changed to Heine. His task was to remain in Moscow, gather information about the location of Soviet troops, the plans of the command, and the mood of the population. and transmit this information to the Germans via radio. But everything he transmitted was controlled by Soviet intelligence. Demyanov became the central figure in Operation Monastery, a grandiose radio game that lasted from 1941 to 1944. Through him, the Germans were fed a carefully measured mixture of truth and lies. Enough truth to keep them trusting the source, and enough lies to mislead them. The success of Operation Monastery exceeded all expectations. The Germans completely trusted Heine. They considered him their best agent in Moscow. Through him, they received information that seemed extremely valuable to them. In reality, they were receiving what Soviet intelligence wanted to give them. Demyanov's most important achievement was his influence on the outcome of the Battle of Stalingrad. In November 1942, on the eve of the Soviet counteroffensive at Stalingrad, Heine informed the Germans that the main strike would not be there, but in the North Caucasus and near Rzhev. The German command believed him and transferred their reserves there. As a result, the encirclement of Paulus's 300,000-strong group near Stalingrad came as a complete surprise to the enemy. However, the price of this success was high. The offensive near Rzhev, Operation Mars, did indeed take place, but the Germans, warned by Heine, were ready. Soviet troops suffered huge losses, tens of thousands killed and wounded. Marshal Zhukov, who commanded this operation, never found out that the enemy had been warned in advance about the offensive. It was a cruel necessity to sacrifice thousands of soldiers in order to save hundreds of thousands of others, and to turn the tide of the entire war. Such was the price of the radio game, but Stalin and the Soviet intelligence leadership considered this price justified. The victory at Stalingrad marked the beginning of a radical turning point in the war, and Heine became an even more valuable agent in the eyes of the Germans. By the summer of 1944, the German command's trust in Demyanov was absolute. He had passed on numerous messages to them, many of which were confirmed by actual events. He seemed to them to be an indispensable source of information from the very heart of the Soviet Union. That is why he was chosen to launch Operation Berezino. If Heine reported the existence of a surrounded German unit under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Scherhorn, the Germans would believe it. They would not question information from their trusted agent. It was the perfect starting point for a new radio game, but it was necessary to create a convincing legend about how Demyanov learned about Scherhorn's unit. According to the legend of the operation, in July 1944, Demyanov was allegedly drafted into the Red Army and sent to serve in one of the military units. This corresponded to the real situation. Many Muscovites of draft age were sent to the front or to rear units. According to the legend, Demyanov was sent to a military unit stationed in the area of the recently liberated Minsk, more precisely, to the town of Berezino. This assignment seemed quite natural. Thousands of Soviet soldiers were transferred to the liberated areas of Belarus to restore order, guard communications, and fight the remnants of German troops. Demyanov's presence in those places was not supposed to arouse any suspicion among the Germans. While in the Berezino area, Demyanov allegedly stumbled upon some important info. According to the story, he overheard Soviet soldiers talking about a German unit of about 2,000 men hiding in the nearby forests. The Soviet command knew about them and was getting ready to clear the area. But for now, the unit was still on the loose. For Demyanov, as a German agent, this was sensational information. He had to immediately report this to his supervisors. 2,000 German soldiers and officers, surrounded in the Soviet rear, were a source of intelligence, a potential sabotage group, and simply people who needed help. The German command had to respond. On August 18, 1944, Demyanov sent a message to Berlin via his radio station. He reported that a large German unit that had lost contact with its command was located in the forests of Belarus, near the Berezina River. There were over 2,000 men. They were commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Scherhorn. The unit was in a difficult situation. They lacked food, medicine, and ammunition. But the soldiers and officers were holding out, ready to fight and waiting for help. Demyanov indicated the approximate location of the unit and said he could try to establish contact with it. This message landed on the desk of German intelligence. Operation Berezino began, one of the most daring and successful hoaxes in the history of the secret services. But would the Germans believe it? And how would they react to this information? In Berlin, Heine's message aroused serious interest. By mid-August 1944, the situation on the Eastern Front was catastrophic for Germany. Army Group Center had been defeated, Belarus was lost, and Soviet troops were rapidly advancing towards the borders of the Reich. In the West, the Allies had secured their position in Normandy and were beginning their advance into France. Germany found itself caught in a pincer movement between two fronts. In such a situation, any good news was received with enthusiasm. And the information that 2,000 German soldiers had survived the encirclement and were ready to continue fighting was a real gift for propaganda and the military command. The Abwehr and other German intelligence services immediately began to verify the information. They dug up documents about the units operating in the Berezino area. They checked the data on Lieutenant Colonel Scherhorn. Such an officer did indeed serve in Army Group Center, and contact with him was lost in July in the Minsk area. Everything added up. Heine's information seemed completely reliable. Moreover, the situation itself was typical of the chaos that reigned on the front in the summer of 1944. Dozens of German units had indeed been cut off from the main forces and were trying to survive in the encirclement. The story about Scherhorn's unit seemed quite plausible. The German officers saw no reason to doubt the information provided by their best agent in Moscow. On August 25, 1944, Heine received a reply radiogram from Berlin. The Germans thanked him for the valuable information and asked him to immediately establish contact with Lieutenant Colonel Scherhorn's unit. They reported that they were ready to provide all possible assistance to the surrounded soldiers, dropping food, medicine, ammunition, and equipment. Moreover, they planned to send a radio operator to Scherhorn, who would establish direct communication between the surrounded unit and the command. This required the exact coordinates of the unit's location, a description of suitable sites for dropping cargo, and, possibly, for landing aircraft. The Germans also warned that their radio operator would arrive in Soviet military uniform so as not to be immediately captured upon landing. This radiogram signaled the complete success of the first stage of the operation. The Germans had taken the bait. They believed in the existence of the Scherhorn unit and were ready to spend resources to support it. Now it was necessary to build on this success and drag out the game as long as possible. On the same day, August 25, the NKVD task force left for the Piasecznoe Lake area. The group included Naumeitingen, Mikhail Makliarsky, Georgy Mordvinov, Yakov Serebryansky, Grigory Zobak, William Fisher, and other experienced intelligence officers. They had to prepare sites for receiving cargo, organize meetings with German agents, and ensure the security of the operation. The location was ideal. The area around Lake Piaseczno was typical Belarusian landscape: dense mixed forests, marshy areas, and small glades among the trees. It was easy to hide from prying eyes here, but at the same time, there were open areas suitable for dropping cargo from aircraft. The nearest large settlements were far enough away to reduce the risk of the operation being accidentally discovered. Soviet scouts carefully surveyed the area, identified the most convenient points for receiving cargo, and set up a surveillance and security system. Everything had to look as if a surrounded German unit was really hiding there. Heine gave the Germans the coordinates and a detailed description of the area. He reported that he had managed to establish contact with Lieutenant Colonel Scherhorn through local residents. The commander of the surrounded unit confirmed his readiness to accept help and reported a critical shortage of everything necessary. His group numbered about 2,000 people, but he could not give an exact figure. Many were wounded, some had been killed in battle, and some had fallen behind while moving through the woods. The unit was in dire need of food, medicine, and bandages. Ammunition was also running out. The soldiers were holding out, but they would not last long without help. This message was intended to prompt the Germans to take immediate action. The German command responded quickly. Preparations for the first airdrop began in early September. The German Air Force allocated transport aircraft to deliver the necessary equipment. The Abwehr selected a radio operator who was to be dropped near Scherhorn to establish direct communication. This man was to become a key link in the communication between the surrounded unit and Berlin. The Germans carefully instructed him, giving him codes, call signs, and frequencies for communication. They even provided him with a Soviet military uniform so that he could move safely behind Red Army lines. Everything was thought out to the smallest detail. But the Germans did not suspect that their every move was being tracked, that their every decision was playing into the hands of Soviet intelligence. In the area of Lake Pisochnoe, Soviet intelligence officers were completing their final preparations. Lieutenant Colonel Scherhorn and his team took up their positions. OMS Bond machine gunners were stationed around the perimeter, ready to intervene at any moment. Radio operators tuned their equipment and waited for the signal. All participants in the operation understood that the most critical phase was beginning. Soon, the first German plane would arrive, drop its cargo, and the radio operator would land. From that moment on, the game would reach a new level. It would be necessary not only to transmit messages, but also to interact with real German agents, convince them of the authenticity of the situation, and extract information from them. The slightest mistake would ruin everything. But the Soviet intelligence officers were ready. It was mid-September 1944. German planes were due to appear in the sky above the Belarusian forests. What would this encounter bring? On the night of September 15-16, 1944, the first German plane appeared over the Belarusian forests. It was a Junkers Ju-52 transport plane, specially equipped for night flights behind enemy lines. On board were containers with food, medicine, and, most importantly, 3 German radio operators and parachutists. Their task was to land in the area where Scherhorn's unit was located, establish direct radio contact with Berlin, and coordinate further assistance to the surrounded German soldiers. The pilots flew the plane at low altitude, navigating by the coordinates they had been given. Below, in the darkness of the forest, signal fires burned. Soviet scouts had marked the drop zone. The operation to receive the German paratroopers had been carefully rehearsed. Soviet scouts knew the exact time of arrival, had a description of the cargo, and information about how many people would be dropped. All the information came from Heine, who transmitted the coordinates to the Germans and simultaneously reported everything to the center. When the plane appeared over the drop zone, a code signal was given from the ground. 3 paratroopers jumped out of the aircraft hatch, one after the other, followed by containers with cargo. A few minutes later, everyone landed safely. The German radio operators were immediately met by people in German uniforms. They were NKVD agents from among the prisoners of war who were part of Scherhorn's fictitious unit. The radio operators were escorted to the unit commander. Lieutenant Colonel Scherhorn greeted them as expected, with military bearing but obvious relief. He thanked them for coming and asked about the situation in Germany and the situation on the front lines. The radio operators, in turn, handed him letters and instructions from Berlin. They were ordered to immediately establish communication and report on the situation. Life was bustling around the improvised military camp. Soldiers were unloading dropped cargo, the wounded were receiving medical attention, and officers were giving orders. Everything looked completely authentic. The German radio operators did not suspect a trick. They really believed that they were among their comrades, surrounded by the Red Army in the rear. That same night, one of the radio operators set up his equipment and established contact with Berlin. He reported, "Landed safely, Found Scherhorn's group. The situation is difficult, but the men are holding out. The lieutenant colonel requests urgent assistance. Food, medicine, and ammunition are needed. Constant communication has been established. This signal was received with enthusiasm in Berlin. Finally, direct contact had been established with the surrounded unit. Now it was possible to coordinate assistance more effectively. The German command immediately began planning the next drops, but they did not know that the radio operator was working under the complete control of the Soviet Special Services. Each of his messages was checked and corrected by experienced specialists. Shortly after the first drop, the Germans sent the radio operator some sensational information. Hitler himself and Reich Marshal Göring had been informed of the actions of the Scherhorn unit. The Führer allegedly personally ordered that all possible assistance be provided to those surrounded, and highly praised their steadfastness. This information was extremely valuable to Soviet intelligence. It meant that the operation had reached the highest level of the German command. Now, helping Scherhorn had become a matter of national importance for Germany. This meant that the Germans would spend more and more resources on it. Every plane flying to a non-existent unit, every agent dropped into the Belarusian forests, every ton of cargo, all of this was distracting from actual combat operations. Soviet intelligence immediately began recruiting the German radio operators who had arrived. It was delicate work. It was not possible to simply capture them and force them to cooperate. The German command might have suspected something was amiss due to the change in the style of radio transmissions. It was necessary to convince the radio operators that resistance was pointless, that the war was lost, and that the only chance of survival was cooperation. Long conversations were held with each of them. They were shown reports from the front lines, told about the scale of the Wehrmacht's defeats, and explained the inevitability of the Third Reich's collapse. They were promised that their lives would be spared and that they would return home after the war. One by one, the radio operators agreed. Some did so out of fear, some out of common sense, and some truly understood that they were fighting a lost cause. Now, communication between part of Scherhorn and Berlin was carried out through German radio operators working under Soviet control. This gave the operation additional credibility. German radio intelligence could verify the handwriting of the radio operators, and it was authentic because real German military signalmen were working. The content of the messages also looked natural. The radio operators transmitted what their Soviet supervisors dictated to them, but they did so in their usual style, using expressions and codes accepted in the Wehrmacht. It was practically impossible to detect the forgery. The German command received first-hand information and had no doubts about its authenticity. In the following weeks of September, the Germans carried out several more cargo drops. Each time, their planes appeared over Lake Pasachnoe at the appointed time and dropped containers with food, medicine, and equipment. Soviet intelligence officers carefully recorded everything they received: the composition of the cargo, its quantity, and its markings. Some of these materials were used directly by the participants in the operation, while others were sent to special laboratories for study. Of particular interest were medicines, new types of equipment, and encryption materials. Each drop provided Soviet intelligence with valuable information about the state of German industry, supply priorities, and new technical developments. In his radio messages, Scherhorn constantly requested new supplies. He reported on injuries among soldiers, ammunition shortages, and food difficulties. The German command willingly complied with these requests. They saw Scherhorn's unit not only as a group of surviving soldiers, but also as a potential base for organizing sabotage operations in the Soviet rear. Through the encircled unit, it was possible to send in scouts, organize sabotage on the railways, and gather information about the movements of Soviet troops. The Germans had far-reaching plans, and Soviet intelligence gave them hope that these plans were feasible. Meanwhile, it was receiving more and more German agents, more and more cargo, and more information. Operation Berezino was gaining momentum. But how long could this illusion be maintained? And what to do with the ever-growing number of captured German agents? As the operation developed, its scale continued to grow. The German command was so enthusiastic about the idea of supporting the surrounded unit that it allocated more and more resources. In October 1944, new radio operators, communications officers, and even several Abwehr employees were sent to Scherhorn to coordinate intelligence work. On December 21, another large drop took place. The Germans dropped not only supplies, but also a new group of specialists, including radio operators and several Belarusians who had been trained in German intelligence schools. These people were supposed to help Scherhorn navigate the terrain and establish contacts with the local population. Each newly arrived German agent was greeted with a carefully staged meeting. Lieutenant Colonel Scherhorn personally talked with them, listened to news from Germany, and received messages from relatives and command. The agents saw a whole military camp around them: tents, dugouts, guards, patrols. They heard German speech, saw familiar military uniforms, and observed the usual army routines. All this created a complete illusion of reality. None of the arrivals suspected that they had fallen into a carefully constructed trap. They believed that they were indeed among 2,000 surrounded German soldiers who were bravely holding out behind enemy lines. Soviet intelligence officers studied each captured agent. They interrogated them, finding out what training they had undergone, what tasks they had been assigned, and what knowledge they possessed. Many of these people were valuable sources of information about the work of the German special services. They talked about the structure of the Abwehr, the methods of training agents, and the plans for intelligence and sabotage operations. All this information was carefully recorded and sent to Moscow. Based on this information, Soviet counterintelligence strengthened rear defenses, identified other German agent networks, and improved methods of combating enemy intelligence. Each captured agent became a treasure trove of intelligence data. Then the recruitment work began. Not everyone agreed to cooperate right away. Some remained loyal to their oath, while others feared reprisals from the German command if the truth came out. But Soviet specialists knew how to find an approach to each individual. Some were told about the hopelessness of the war for Germany, shown the real situation on the front lines, and convinced of the inevitability of the Third Reich's defeat. Others were simply made to understand that the alternative to cooperation was a camp or execution. Some were promised material goods and safety. The methods varied, but the result was the same. The overwhelming majority of captured agents eventually agreed to work for Soviet intelligence. Those who agreed became part of an extensive radio game system. They were not simply forced to pass on disinformation to the Germans. They were taught to do so convincingly. Briefings, rehearsals, and checks were conducted. Each radio message was carefully thought out. It had to contain the right combination of truth and lies, reflect the real situation in Scherhorn's unit, but at the same time mislead the Germans about the unit's capabilities and plans. Soviet specialists created entire storylines about clashes with Soviet patrols, movements through the forests, supply problems, and the morale of the soldiers. All this created a voluminous, multifaceted picture that looked absolutely credible. Particular attention was paid to simulating the combat activity of Scherhorn's unit. Simply sitting in the forest and waiting for help would have been implausible. The surrounded German unit had to do something: conduct reconnaissance, carry out sabotage, obtain food, and fight off Soviet troops. Therefore, Scherhorn regularly reported on various actions taken by his men. They allegedly attacked a Soviet convoy and captured food supplies. They repelled an attack by partisans. They conducted reconnaissance of the railway line. They captured a prisoner from whom they obtained valuable information. All these reports were carefully coordinated with the actual situation in the region, so that the Germans could partially verify the information and ensure its accuracy. The German command was delighted to receive reports of Scherhorn's unit's combat activity. This confirmed their perception of the resilience and fighting spirit of the surrounded soldiers. Enthusiastic reports about the heroism of the lieutenant colonel and his men were compiled in Berlin. The propaganda department even planned to use this story to boost the morale of the troops. "Look," they said, "at our soldiers, even in a hopeless situation. They do not give up, but continue to fight." However, the story was not widely publicized. The Germans feared that the Soviet command would learn of the unit's location and launch a special operation to eliminate it. They preferred to keep the information secret so as not to expose Scherhorn to additional danger. Soviet intelligence carefully rationed reports on the activities of Scherhorn's unit. They couldn't overdo it. A unit that was too active and successful would look suspicious. But complete passivity would also raise questions. A balance was needed. Scherhorn had to show that his people were holding out, but with great difficulty, that they were capable of individual actions, but not large-scale operations, that they were resilient but exhausted, that they vitally needed help, without which they would not survive. This image of a heroic but desperate struggle for survival perfectly matched German ideas of military duty and honor, and the Germans believed it. They continued to send supplies, drop agents, and make plans to rescue their surrounded comrades. By the end of 1944, Operation Berezino had become a large-scale undertaking involving dozens of Soviet intelligence officers, more than 20 captured German agents, and significant material resources on both sides. The Germans had already made more than 10 sorties, dropped hundreds of kilograms of cargo, and spent huge sums of money on organizing aid. Soviet intelligence obtained invaluable information about the work of the German special services, neutralized more than 24 enemy agents, and continued to extract resources from the enemy. But the main test for the operation was still ahead. The Red Army was rapidly advancing westward. The front line was moving further and further away from Belarus. Sooner or later, the Germans would have to ask themselves why part of Scherhorn's forces had not yet attempted to break through to their own lines. How did Soviet intelligence plan to solve this problem? With the onset of winter in 1944-1945, the operation faced new challenges. The Red Army continued its rapid advance westward. In January 1945, the Vistula-Oder offensive began, as a result of which Soviet troops liberated a significant part of Poland and entered German territory. The front line moved hundreds of kilometers west of the place where, according to legend, Scherhorn's unit was located. A logical question arose. Why did the surrounded German unit remain in the Belarusian forests instead of trying to break through to their own lines? After all, the distance to the German positions was growing, and the chances of a successful breakthrough were dwindling. The German command did indeed begin to ask this question. From the end of October 1944, radio messages from Berlin increasingly contained insistent demands. When would Scherhorn attempt to bring his unit to the front line? Why was he delaying? Did he not understand that time was working against him? The Germans even offered to organize the landing of heavy transport planes to evacuate at least some of the surrounded soldiers. They were willing to take a significant risk just to save 2,000 of their servicemen. Such attention and care seemed touching, but created serious problems for the continuation of the operation. Soviet intelligence needed to find a convincing explanation for why part of Scherhorn's forces remained in place. The solution was found in the creation of plausible obstacles. Scherhorn began to report that every attempt to move westward ended in a clash with Soviet troops. Soviet patrols, partisan detachments, and regular Red Army units engaged in mopping up the rear constantly appeared in their area. Several times, the unit tried to break out and move towards the front, but each time it encountered superior enemy forces and was forced to retreat back into the woods. In the process, it suffered losses: killed, wounded, and stragglers. The number of troops was dwindling. Ammunition was running out. The food situation was deteriorating. The morale of the soldiers was falling. All this created a picture of a hopeless situation. To lend credibility to these reports, Soviet intelligence even organized real military operations in the area of Lake Pisochno. Red Army units were sent there to conduct training exercises, maneuvers, and patrols. German reconnaissance aircraft flying over the area could indeed observe Soviet troop activity. This confirmed Scherhorn's claim that the area was saturated with enemy forces. German aerial reconnaissance recorded the movements of Soviet units and transmitted the information to headquarters. Analysts compared the reconnaissance data with Scherhorn's reports, and everything matched. The lieutenant colonel was telling the truth about the presence of Soviet troops. This meant that the rest of his information could also be trusted. In addition, Scherhorn referred to severe weather conditions. The winter of 1944-1945 was harsh. Deep snow, frost, and blizzards made it difficult for large groups of people to move through forests and swamps. Many soldiers were wounded or sick and unable to make long marches. There was a shortage of warm clothing, footwear, and food for the march. Attempting to move in such conditions would have meant the death of a significant number of people from frostbite, exhaustion, and disease. It was wiser to wait out the winter in shelter, build up strength and supplies, and plan a breakthrough for the spring. This logic was clear to the German command. They themselves knew very well what it was like to fight in the Russian winter. Scherhorn's explanations seemed reasonable. Nevertheless, the Germans did not give up their attempts to evacuate at least some of the surrounded soldiers. They proposed dropping a special group from planes, which would clear a route to the front line and provide cover for the breakthrough. They discussed the possibility of coordinating with German units on the front line, which could launch a diversionary attack while Scherhorn's unit moved west. They even considered organizing a large-scale operation to rescue the surrounded soldiers, involving significant air and ground forces. All these plans were developed seriously, with the involvement of experienced officers and taking into account intelligence data. The Germans really wanted to save their people. Soviet intelligence carefully monitored all these plans and proposals. Each time, there were reasons for refusal or postponement. Sometimes the weather was unfavorable for flying. Sometimes Soviet troops increased their activity. Sometimes planes could not land due to the condition of the airfields. Or some other circumstances arose. Scherhorn demonstrated a willingness to cooperate, but each time something prevented the plans from being carried out. This required great skill. It was necessary to constantly keep the Germans' hopes alive without allowing them to carry out their intentions. Balancing on the edge was risky, but Soviet intelligence officers managed. They learned to sense the mood of the German command and to provide new information at the right time, which justified the delays and gave hope for the future. One way to delay the operation was to play with the numbers of Scherhorn's unit. The lieutenant colonel periodically reported losses. After another clash with Soviet troops, the unit's strength had been reduced by several dozen more men. They were dead, wounded, and missing. But at the same time, other German soldiers who had been wandering in the woods after being surrounded were supposedly joining the unit from time to time. The number of soldiers would decrease, then increase slightly. This created a dynamic picture in which it was difficult for the German command to accurately determine the real state of the unit. The constant variability of the data was entirely consistent with the chaotic situation of guerrilla warfare behind enemy lines. By the spring of 1945, the situation on the front lines was becoming increasingly catastrophic for Germany. Soviet troops were already on the outskirts of Berlin. The Allies crossed the Rhine and advanced from the west. The defeat of the Third Reich was obvious to everyone, but the German command continued to maintain contact with Scherhorn's unit and even continued to supply it. This showed how deeply they believed in the reality of this unit and how important they considered it to be for their plans. Soviet intelligence continued to play along, knowing that the end was near. But until the war was over, Operation Berezino had to continue. Every day of the game meant additional resources diverted from actual combat operations. Each radiogram provided new information about the state of the German special services. Every abandoned agent became a source of valuable information. The operation continued, but its end was already in sight. How would this grand deception end? The beginning of 1945 was marked by a new complication in the legend of Operation Berezino. Soviet intelligence decided to divide the fictitious part of Scherhorn into several groups. According to the legend, due to constant pressure from Soviet troops and partisans, the lieutenant colonel was forced to disperse his forces. Now, his unit consisted of 3 separate groups located in different places, several dozen kilometers apart. This was explained by security considerations. Dispersed groups are more difficult to detect and destroy. They can act more flexibly, maneuver, and evade pursuit. Each group had its own commander, its own tasks, and its own radio communication. This complication of the legend served several purposes. First, it explained why part of Scherhorn's group could not come together for an organized breakout to their own lines. The groups were separated by distance and Soviet troops between them, making it too risky to join forces. Second, the division into groups required the Germans to increase the volume of supplies. Now it was necessary to organize drops of cargo to several different points. Third, it made it possible to create a more complex radio communication system involving different operators, which made the game even more realistic. Fourth, there were additional opportunities to receive German agents. They could be dropped to different groups, ostensibly to coordinate actions. The German command accepted the information about the division of Scherhorn's unit with understanding. From a military point of view, this decision seemed reasonable. Indeed, in the conditions of guerrilla warfare behind enemy lines, it is better to operate in small, mobile groups than to stick together in one large unit, which is easy to detect and surround. German generals themselves used similar tactics in various operations. They approved the lieutenant colonel's actions and agreed to organize supplies for all 3 groups. This meant an increase in the number of flights, higher fuel consumption, and the need for more complex coordination. But the Germans were willing to make these sacrifices to save their soldiers. Soviet intelligence took advantage of the division of the unit to further develop the operation. Now the radiograms came from different commanders, each describing the situation in his area. One reported a clash with partisans, another reported the successful capture of food supplies, and a third reported the difficult situation with the wounded. This chorus of voices created a comprehensive, realistic picture. German analysts received information from several sources that complemented and confirmed each other. It was virtually impossible to expose such a mosaic as a fake. It looked too complex, too detailed, too plausible to be a fabrication. The cargo drops continued with enviable regularity. German planes appeared over the Belarusian forests 2 or 3 times a month, and sometimes more often. Each time they dropped dozens of containers with food, medicine, ammunition, and uniforms. Soviet intelligence officers carefully received the cargo, sorted it, and compiled detailed inventories. Some of the materials were used directly by the participants in the operation. After all, they also needed to eat and clothe themselves. Some of it was sent to special institutions for study. Medicines were of particular interest. Some of them were the latest developments of the German pharmaceutical industry, unknown to Soviet specialists. In addition to cargo, the Germans continued to drop agents. By the end of the operation, their number had reached 22. They were radio operators, communications officers, scouts, saboteurs, and specialists in various fields. Each of them was met, placed in the Scherhorn unit, interviewed, and gradually recruited. Some agreed to cooperate quickly, realizing the hopelessness of their situation. Others resisted longer, but ultimately gave in as well. Only a few remained unbroken until the end. They were kept separately, under strict control, and were not allowed to have contact with others. But their silence could not harm the operation. They simply disappeared from the view of the German command, which wrote them off as losses. The thoroughness with which the Germans checked the cargoes spoke to the seriousness of their intentions. They did not simply drop random collections of food and equipment. Each drop was planned in accordance with Scherhorn's requests. The lieutenant colonel reported that he was short of bandages, and the next drop included bandages, cotton wool, and antiseptics. He asked for warm clothing, and they sent sheepskin coats, felt boots, and warm underwear. He requested specific ammunition and received exactly what he asked for. This responsiveness on the part of the German command showed how important they considered support for Scherhorn's unit to be. Meanwhile, Soviet intelligence continued to compile new lists of necessities, extracting resources from the enemy. The overall statistics for the operation by the spring of 1945 were impressive. The Germans made 39 sorties to supply Scherhorn's unit. They dropped 255 cargo drops weighing several tons. They dropped 22 agents. They spent 1,777,000 rubles in Soviet currency, which they printed for use in the occupied territories, and a significant amount of Reichsmarks. They consumed thousands of liters of aviation fuel, wore out their aircraft, and employed numerous personnel. All this distracted from the real military needs of the dying Reich, and Soviet intelligence obtained invaluable information, neutralized 24 enemy agents, and proved its superiority in the field of radio warfare. But the time for the operation was running out. The Red Army was storming Berlin. Hitler was in his bunker, surrounded by the ruins of the Third Reich's capital. The Western Allies were advancing from the other side. Germany's defeat was a matter of days, and Soviet intelligence was preparing for the finale of Operation Berezino, a finale that had to be worthy of this grandiose deception. The last radio messages from Scherhorn's unit were to go down in intelligence history as a model of professionalism and creativity in information warfare. But how exactly to end the game? What should be the last words of Lieutenant Colonel Scherhorn, who had fought bravely for 9 months while surrounded, and who, in fact, never existed? One of the key elements in maintaining the legend of Scherhorn's unit was the simulation of active combat operations against Soviet troops. Simply hiding in the woods and waiting for help was not enough. The surrounded German unit had to do something, had to pose a real threat to the Soviet rear. Therefore, Scherhorn regularly reported on various sabotage and reconnaissance operations carried out by his men. These reports created the image of an active, combat-ready unit that did not give up and continued to fulfill its military duty even in a hopeless situation. The German command received such news with enthusiasm and pride. The reports on sabotage were varied and carefully thought out. Scherhorn reported on an attack on a Soviet transport convoy, which resulted in the capture of food and ammunition. He reported on the blowing up of a railroad track, which allegedly led to the crash of a train carrying military cargo. He told of a successful ambush on a Soviet patrol, in which several Red Army soldiers were killed and one officer was taken prisoner. He reported on reconnaissance of Soviet military facilities, warehouses, headquarters, airfields. Each such report was accompanied by details that made it seem plausible. Soviet intelligence was very cautious in creating these stories. It was impossible to simply invent sabotage operations. The Germans could verify the information through their agents or aerial reconnaissance. Therefore, Scherhorn's reports were partly based on real events in the region. If sabotage or an attack on Soviet troops really took place somewhere, possibly by real German saboteurs or bandits, Scherhorn's unit could take credit for the action. The Germans, hearing about the sabotage from other sources and receiving confirmation from Scherhorn, believed that it was the work of his men. This technique made it possible to create a convincing picture of activity. Sometimes, Soviet intelligence even organized real incidents specifically to confirm the legend. For example, a section of railroad track on an insignificant branch line was blown up in a certain area, and Scherhorn immediately reported on this operation by his people. German aerial reconnaissance recorded the damage, German agents spread rumors of sabotage. And all this confirmed Scherhorn's words. Of course, such actions required careful coordination and were not supposed to cause serious harm to Soviet military efforts. But they created the necessary effect of plausibility. Particular attention was paid to reports of captured prisoners and trophies. Scherhorn periodically reported that his men had captured Soviet soldiers or officers and obtained valuable information from them about the location of Soviet troops, the plans of the command, and the mood in the Red Army. This information was then passed on to the German command as intelligence. Of course, all of this was disinformation, carefully prepared by the Soviet secret services. But for the Germans, this data looked like valuable first-hand intelligence obtained directly at the scene of events. The imitation of combat operations also helped to explain the losses in Scherhorn's unit. Periodically, the lieutenant colonel reported that several of his soldiers had been killed or wounded in another clash with Soviet troops. The unit's strength gradually declined from 2,000 men at the start of the operation to 1,500 by the spring of 1945. These losses seemed natural for a unit engaged in constant combat behind enemy lines. The German command accepted this news with regret, but did not question it. War is war, and losses are inevitable. Soviet intelligence used reports of sabotage for another purpose, to force the Germans to send even more supplies. After each battle, Scherhorn reported on ammunition consumption, damage to equipment, and the need for medicine for the wounded. The Germans willingly complied with these requests, believing that they were supporting the combat capability of a unit that was inflicting damage on the Soviet rear. They did not understand that every container of ammunition dropped, every box of medicine, fell into the hands of Soviet intelligence and would never be used against the Red Army. The German command believed so much in the activity of Scherhorn's unit that it even began to coordinate some of its operations with it. For example, when an offensive was planned on the front, Scherhorn was asked to carry out sabotage in the Soviet rear to distract the enemy's attention. The lieutenant colonel agreed and then reported on the completion of the task. In reality, of course, no sabotage was carried out, but the Germans believed Scherhorn's reports and believed that they had received support from the surrounded unit. This was the highest level of radio warfare, when the enemy not only believes in the existence of a fictional unit, but also tries to use it in its military plans. By the spring of 1945, the simulation of combat activity became even more important. The Red Army was advancing on all fronts, and Germany was on the verge of collapse. In such conditions, the German command was in particular need of good news, of examples of the steadfastness and heroism of its soldiers. Scherhorn's unit provided them with this psychological support. The story of German soldiers who, month after month, held out while surrounded, fought off the enemy, and did not lose their fighting spirit, inspired hope. Even if this hope was illusory, even if the whole story was a fabrication of Soviet intelligence, it played its part in maintaining the morale of the German command. And this was also a result of Operation Berezino. As the spring of 1945 approached, the question of Scherhorn's unit breaking through to German positions became increasingly acute. The front line was already hundreds of kilometers west of Belarus. Soviet troops were stationed on the Oder, preparing to storm Berlin. In such a situation, it became increasingly difficult to continue to claim that the surrounded unit could not begin to move. The German command insisted that Scherhorn attempt a breakthrough. They even offered to organize a counterattack from the front to facilitate the breakthrough of the surrounded troops. Soviet intelligence needed to find new arguments to delay the operation. From the end of October 1944, the Germans began to insist on organizing the landing of transport planes to evacuate at least the wounded and sick from Scherhorn's unit. They were willing to risk heavy Junkers aircraft or even four-engine Focke-Wulf Condors to save their people. Soviet intelligence faced a dilemma. On the one hand, refusing to allow the evacuation could arouse suspicion. Why didn't Scherhorn want to rescue at least the most seriously ill? On the other hand, Allowing German aircraft to land posed enormous risks. The pilots could notice inconsistencies, could try to take too many people on board, and the situation could get out of control. Scherhorn began to explain that landing planes in their area was extremely dangerous and practically impossible. All suitable landing sites were under Soviet military surveillance. Any attempt to land would attract attention and lead to an attack. In addition, the landing sites themselves were in poor condition. After rains and thaws, the soil had become waterlogged, making it impossible for a heavily loaded plane to take off. In winter, everything is covered with deep snow, which also makes it impossible to land safely. Moreover, Scherhorn reported that his men were constantly being pursued by Soviet patrols. As soon as they stopped in one place for more than a few days, the Red Army soldiers appeared. They had to constantly change their location, going deeper and deeper into the forests. These explanations partially satisfied the Germans, but did not completely allay their concerns. They continued to insist on at least an attempt. Then Scherhorn resorted to a ruse. He agreed to prepare a landing site for the plane. For several weeks, he reported on the progress of the work. His men were clearing the snow, leveling the surface, and installing landmarks. But every time the Germans set a departure date, something unexpected happened. Either a Soviet patrol suddenly appeared and they had to urgently change their position, or the weather deteriorated. Blizzards, fog, low clouds. Or the equipment for sending light signals broke down. There was always a reason for a delay. Sometimes the weather deteriorated. Blizzards, fog, low clouds. Sometimes the equipment for sending light signals broke down. There was always a reason for a delay. The German command showed remarkable patience. They really wanted to save their soldiers and were willing to wait for the right moment. But time passed, and the right moment never came. Soviet intelligence masterfully balanced between maintaining hope and preventing the actual landing of the German plane. This required subtle psychological calculation. It was necessary to accurately sense when the Germans were beginning to lose patience and to provide them with new information at the right moment to revive their hope. Sometimes Scherhorn reported that the landing site was almost ready. Sometimes he reported that the weather was improving. Sometimes he promised that in a few days, everything would be ready to receive the aircraft. At the same time, Scherhorn continued to insist that it was impossible to organize a breakthrough of the entire unit to the front line. He explained that a journey of several hundred kilometers through territories saturated with Soviet troops was practically impossible for 1,500 people, many of whom were wounded or sick. They lacked transportation and could only move on foot. There was not enough food for such a long march. Winter and spring thaw made movement even more difficult. An attempt to break through would mean the death of most people from exhaustion, frostbite, and disease, not to mention the inevitable battles with Soviet units. Instead of a breakthrough, Scherhorn proposed an alternative strategy: to remain in place, survive the winter and spring, and in the summer, when conditions improved, attempt to infiltrate the front line in small groups, or wait until German troops went on the offensive again, which of course was no longer likely, and the front line approached their positions. This wait-and-see strategy seemed reasonable to the German command, although not very promising. They understood that the chances of a successful breakthrough were indeed slim, and therefore agreed with Scherhorn's cautious approach. The main thing was to keep people alive, and then see what happened. Soviet intelligence used the landing requirements to obtain additional information from the Germans. While discussing the technical details of a possible landing, Scherhorn pried information out of German specialists about the characteristics of transport aircraft, their capabilities, night navigation methods, and means of communication. All this information was valuable to the Soviet Air Force and Air Defense. The Germans, wanting to help Scherhorn prepare for the arrival of the aircraft, willingly shared technical details, unaware that this information was immediately passed on to the Soviet General Staff. By April 1945, the situation on the front lines had become crystal clear. Germany was losing the war. Berlin was surrounded by Soviet troops. The Allies were advancing throughout Germany, and the German army was falling apart. In such circumstances, continuing Operation Berezino might have seemed pointless. But Soviet intelligence continued the game until the very end. As long as the Germans were willing to supply the Scherhorn unit, as long as they sent cargo and agents, the operation continued. Every day of the game meant additional resources diverted from the dying Reich. Every radiogram brought new information. The game went on until the very end. But the end was already near. How would this grand deception, which had lasted 9 months, end? The spring of 1945 was a time of agony for the Third Reich. Soviet troops stormed Berlin. The Western Allies met with units of the Red Army on the Elbe. Germany was cut into pieces, its armed forces defeated, its cities in ruins. Adolf Hitler was in his bunker under the Reich Chancellery, cut off from the real world, giving orders to armies that no longer existed. The end was obvious to everyone. But even in this situation, the German command continued to maintain contact with Lieutenant Colonel Scherhorn's unit. This showed how deeply they believed in the reality of this unit, and how important they considered it to be for themselves. As the Red Army advanced westward, Scherhorn's unit, according to legend, found itself deeper and deeper in the Soviet rear. While in August 1944 the front was relatively close to Belarus, by the spring of 1945 the line of battle had moved into Germany itself. Hundreds of kilometers of territory completely controlled by Soviet troops lay between Scherhorn's unit and the German positions. Breaking through such a distance was physically impossible. Scherhorn continued to explain this to the German command, which bitterly agreed with his arguments. The paradoxical situation was that Scherhorn's unit could not catch up with the front. While they were in the Belarusian forests, the line of battle had moved far to the west. The lieutenant colonel reported that his men were trying to move towards the front, but the Soviet troops were advancing even faster. Every attempt to get closer to the front line was met with new Soviet units moving westward. The density of Soviet troops in the rear was so high that it was impossible for a large group to move unnoticed. They had to maneuver, dodge, and hide. Meanwhile, the front line was moving further and further away. It was a cruel irony of fate for the fictional surrounded soldiers. In April 1945, fighting began directly on German territory. Soviet troops fought in the streets of German cities. The Western Allies were advancing from the other side. The territory controlled by the Germans was shrinking like shagreen leather. In such a situation, the German command was physically unable to organize any help for Scherhorn's unit. They had no planes, the Air Force had been destroyed or had no fuel. There were no supplies. The warehouses had been captured or destroyed. There were no agents. All sabotage schools had been closed or evacuated. But communication with Scherhorn continued. Radiograms were sent back and forth until the very last days of the war. In his last messages, Scherhorn described the desperate situation of his unit. Food was running out. Medicines were exhausted. Ammunition was almost depleted. Many soldiers were sick or wounded. Morale was falling. People understood that there was practically no chance of rescue, but they continued to hold on, continuing to believe in a miracle. These messages broke the hearts of the German officers who read them in their headquarters. They wanted to help, but they couldn't. All they could do was send words of support, promises that they had not been forgotten, that their feat would not go unappreciated. But everyone understood that this was the end. Soviet intelligence closely monitored the mood of the German command. Through intercepted radio messages, prisoner testimony, and other sources, they saw that the enemy was on the verge of collapse. Continuing Operation Berezino after Germany's surrender was pointless. It was necessary to end the game with dignity, so that the Germans would not suspect deception until the very end. The final chord of this grandiose hoax was being prepared. The last radio messages had to be dramatic, convincing, and memorable. They had to put an end to the story of Lieutenant Colonel Scherhorn's non-existent unit. On April 29, 1945, Soviet troops stormed into the center of Berlin. The red banner flew over the Reichstag. Hitler was in his bunker, preparing to commit suicide. On April 30th, the Führer took his own life. On May 1, the new German government announced his death. The news spread instantly throughout the German army. Even those who had believed in victory until the very end now understood that it was all over. The German command relayed this news to Scherhorn's unit. The message was brief and tragic. The Führer had fallen in the battle for Berlin. Germany was surrendering, and resistance was futile. Scherhorn accepted the message and replied. His radiogram was full of bitterness and dignity. He thanked the command for the help they had given his unit over all these months. He thanked them for their faith in them, for their support, for not forgetting them. He said that his soldiers had fought to the end, doing their duty, that they were proud to have remained true to their oath, that even when surrounded, behind enemy lines with no hope of rescue, they did not surrender, did not betray, did not waver. It was a farewell from heroes to a dying homeland, a farewell from fictional soldiers to a real army that never existed. On May 5, 1945, 3 days before Germany's official surrender, Scherhorn sent his last radio message. It was short. The lieutenant colonel reported that his unit was surrounded by superior Soviet forces. They had run out of ammunition. It was impossible to continue the resistance. He thanked everyone who had helped them. He said goodbye to his comrades. He sent his last greetings to Germany. The connection was lost. The radio station, which for 9 months had been transmitting the voice of a non-existent unit from the Belarusian forests, fell silent. Operation Berezino was over. One of the most successful radio games in the history of intelligence ended with the war. But what did the results of this operation show? And what was the fate of its participants? When the radio station of the Scherhorn unit fell silent on May 5, 1945, the German command took it as a tragedy. They were convinced that the brave soldiers who had held out for 9 months while surrounded had ultimately been killed or taken prisoner. The story of Lieutenant Colonel Scherhorn and his men seemed to them an example of heroism, loyalty to duty, and fortitude. Some German officers even planned to find the survivors after the war and reward them for their courage. They had no idea that they had fallen victim to a grand deception, that they had been communicating by radio with Soviet intelligence for 9 months, and that all their cargo and agents had fallen into enemy hands from the very first day of that operation. The results of Operation Berezino exceeded all expectations of the Soviet command. Between August 1944 and May 1945, the Germans made 39 sorties to supply a non-existent unit. These were long-distance flights by heavy transport aircraft, at night, over enemy territory. Each such flight required a significant amount of aviation fuel, which was in short supply in Germany. Each flight wore out expensive equipment. Each flight distracted pilots and maintenance personnel from other tasks. In the conditions of total war, these resources were critically important. A total of 255 cargo drops were made. This amounted to several tons of food, medicine, ammunition, uniforms, and equipment. Each container was carefully packed with canned food, crackers, sugar, salt, tea, coffee, chocolate, and cigarettes. The medicines included antibiotics, painkillers, bandages, and surgical instruments. The ammunition consisted of cartridges of various calibers, grenades, and explosives. The uniforms included warm clothing, shoes, underwear, tents, and sleeping bags. Every item was valuable. All of this went to the Soviet side, which used some of it for its own needs and sent some of it for study. 22 German agents were dropped near Scherhorn's unit. They were radio operators, communications officers, scouts, saboteurs, and specialists in various fields. All of them had been trained in German intelligence schools, possessed special skills, and had assignments from the Abwehr or other special services. Each of them posed a potential threat to the Soviet rear, but all of them were neutralized from the moment they landed. Most were recruited and used in the interests of Soviet intelligence. Some provided valuable information about the structure of the German special services, their methods of operation, and their plans for operations. All of them were taken out of the game without causing any harm. The financial costs to the Germans were also significant. 1,777,000 rubles in Soviet currency, which the Germans printed for use in the occupied territories. A large amount of Reichsmarks, gold coins and jewelry, which were to be used to purchase food from the local population. All of this fell into the hands of Soviet intelligence. Soviet money was destroyed so as not to cause inflation. Reichsmarks and gold replenished the state treasury. For the dying Reich, which desperately needed financial resources, these losses were significant. But the most valuable result of the operation was information. Over the course of 9 months of radio games, Soviet intelligence obtained a huge amount of data on the work of the German special services. The structure of the Abwehr, methods of recruiting and training agents, encryption and radio communication technologies, plans for sabotage and reconnaissance operations. All this became known thanks to captured agents and intercepted radio messages. This information was used to strengthen the security of the Soviet rear, to identify other German agent networks, and to improve counterintelligence methods. The experience of Operation Berezino became training material for several generations of Soviet intelligence officers. In addition, the operation had important psychological significance. For 9 months, the German command believed in the existence of Scherhorn's unit. This story gave them hope, sustained their morale, and served as an example of fortitude. When the truth came out after the war, many German soldiers were shocked. It turned out that they had been fooled all these months, that their care and assistance had gone to the enemy, that no heroic unit had ever existed. This was a blow to the pride of the German special services. It demonstrated the superiority of Soviet intelligence in the field of radio games and disinformation. It became a lesson that even reliable sources cannot be trusted in intelligence warfare. The participation of the legendary German saboteur Otto Skorzeny in the operation deserves special mention. This man became famous for his daring operations. The liberation of Mussolini, the capture of the regent of Hungary Miklos Horthy, and the leadership of Operation Griffin during the Ardennes offensive. Skorzeny was considered one of the Third Reich's best specialists in special operations. It was he who coordinated the supply of Scherhorn's unit, organized the drop of agents, and planned operations to rescue those surrounded. All his skill and experience were used to support a non-existent unit. After the war, Skorzeny wrote his memoirs, in which he proudly recounted his successful assistance to the heroes who were surrounded. He never learned the truth. At the time of publication of his books, information about Operation Berezino remained classified. The success of the operation was recognized at the highest level. Many participants received government awards. Pavel Sudoplatov, Naum Eitingen, Mikhail Makliarsky, and other officers and agents who participated in the operation were awarded orders and medals. Alexander Demyanov, Agent Gaina, without whom the operation would have been impossible, also received high awards, although his name remained secret for decades. Operation Berezino entered the textbooks of intelligence as a model of successful radio play, as an example of how to deceive the enemy over a long period of time and derive maximum benefit from it. But what happened to the main protagonist, Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich Scherhorn? Heinrich Scherhorn's fate after the end of the operation was not easy. In the spring of 1945, when the war ended, he found himself in a unique position. Formally, he remained a German prisoner of war, but at the same time he had been cooperating with Soviet intelligence for 9 months, playing a key role in one of the most successful operations. The Soviet leadership highly appreciated his contribution. Scherhorn was provided with comfortable conditions, good food, and medical care. He was not sent to a prisoner of war camp, but was kept separately, in conditions similar to house arrest. But the question remained, what to do with him next? Initially, Soviet intelligence planned to use Scherhorn for a new operation. In 1946, an attempt was made to use him to recruit Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, one of the highest-ranking military leaders of the Third Reich and commander of the German Navy until 1943. Raeder was in custody after the Nuremberg trials. The idea was that Scherhorn, as a former Wehrmacht officer, would establish contact with Raeder and try to persuade him to cooperate with the Soviet secret services. Such a high-level agent would be extremely valuable for intelligence work. However, this attempt was unsuccessful. Despite Germany's defeat and his own imprisonment, Raeder remained true to his convictions and refused to cooperate. He showed strength of character and did not give in to persuasion. The failure of this operation meant that further use of Scherhorn for intelligence purposes was problematic. He had no other high-level connections in German military or political circles. His value as an agent had diminished. The question of his future remained to be decided. Send him to a prisoner of war camp, keep him under the control of the secret services, or allow him to return to Germany. Ultimately, the decision was made to repatriate Scherhorn to Germany. By that time, Germany had been divided into 4 occupation zones: Soviet, American, British, and French. Scherhorn was sent to the Soviet occupation zone, which later became the German Democratic Republic, GDR, a socialist state under the control of the USSR. It was a logical decision. In East Germany, Scherhorn would be under the supervision of the Soviet secret services, but he would formally be a free man. He could start a new life, but at the same time remain a potentially useful agent in case of need. Little is known about Scherhorn's later life in the GDR. Archival data on this subject remains classified or has been lost. It is known that he did not hold any high positions, did not attract attention to himself, and lived quietly and inconspicuously. Perhaps he was given some kind of job, perhaps a pension for his participation in the operation. The Soviet secret services probably kept in touch with him, but did not actively use him. He was a man with a secret past that few people knew about. Information about Operation Berezino remained strictly classified for decades, so Scherhorn could not talk about his role, even if he wanted to. The other participants in the operation went their separate ways. Pavel Sudoplatov continued to lead special operations until 1953, when he was arrested after Stalin's death and spent 15 years in prison. After his release, he wrote his memoirs, in which he described Operation Berezino and his other activities in detail. Naum Eitingen was also arrested and spent many years in camps, only to be rehabilitated in the 1960s. Mikhail Makliarsky became a famous screenwriter, working on popular Soviet films, but kept quiet about his intelligence past. William Fisher continued his work in intelligence and was later sent to the United States, where he operated under the name Rudolf Abel until his arrest in 1957. Alexander Demyanov, Agent Heine, hero of Operations Monastery and Berezino, continued to work in Soviet intelligence after the war. His name remained secret until the late 1980s. Only after the collapse of the USSR was information about his exploits partially declassified. Demyanov lived a long life, received numerous awards, but never sought publicity. He was a professional intelligence officer of the old school, for whom secrecy was more important than fame. His contribution to the victory in the Great Patriotic War cannot be overestimated. It was thanks to his work that 2 grandiose radio games became possible, which brought enormous benefits to the Soviet side. German prisoners of war who participated in the operation as members of the fictitious Scherhorn unit also met with different fates. Some remained in the USSR and even received Soviet citizenship. Others were repatriated to Germany after their term of captivity ended. Their participation in the operation was kept secret, and they could not talk about what they had been doing in 1944-1945. For them, It was an unusual experience of military captivity. Instead of camps and hard labor, they participated in an intelligence operation, lived in relatively comfortable conditions, and contributed to the end of the war. Operation Berezino became a legend of Soviet intelligence. It was discussed in closed training institutions of the special services and studied as an example of professionalism and creative approach. But it remained unknown to the general public for many years. It was only in the 1990s, after the collapse of the USSR, that information began to leak into the open press. Books, articles, and documentaries about the operation began to appear. The names of the heroic intelligence officers were revealed. The story of Lieutenant Colonel Scherhorn and his non-existent unit became public knowledge. People were amazed. How was it possible to deceive the enemy's professional intelligence services for so long and so successfully? What skill, what composure, what attention to detail was required for this? Operation Berezino showed that in intelligence warfare, it is not the strongest who wins, but the smartest. And in 1944-1945, Soviet intelligence was definitely smarter than its opponents. The significance of Operation Berezino for the history of intelligence is difficult to overestimate. It was one of the longest, largest, and most successful radio games of World War II. For 9 months, from August 1944 to May 1945, Soviet intelligence successfully maintained the illusion of a large German military unit in its rear. During this time, the enemy spent enormous resources, receiving nothing in return but misinformation. Moreover, the Germans were convinced of their success. They believed that they were helping their soldiers, that they were obtaining valuable intelligence, and that they were using the surrounded unit to carry out sabotage in the Soviet rear. The operation demonstrated several key principles of successful radio warfare. First, the importance of a trusted communication channel. Without Agent Gaina, whom the Germans trusted completely after 3 years of successful work in Operation Monastery, Berezino would have been impossible to launch. The Germans believed in the existence of Scherhorn's unit precisely because the information came from a reliable source. Second, the need to create a multi-level verification system. The information came not only from Heine, but also from Scherhorn himself, from captured and recruited German radio operators, and was partially confirmed by aerial reconnaissance data. This multi-channel approach made the disinformation particularly convincing. Thirdly, attention to detail was of critical importance. Every radiogram, every message was carefully thought out. The technical features of radio communication, the psychology of the enemy, and the real situation on the front lines were all taken into account. The slightest inconsistency could arouse suspicion. Soviet intelligence officers worked like jewelers, checking every word, every number, every detail of the legend. Fourth, the importance of patience and endurance. The operation could have been ruined by a single careless action. Constant tension, control, and readiness for the unexpected were required. And Soviet intelligence officers demonstrated these qualities to the fullest. Operation Berezino had not only practical, but also symbolic significance. It showed that Soviet intelligence was not inferior to, but in many ways superior to, the enemy's special services. The German Abwehr was considered one of the best intelligence organizations in the world. Otto Skorzeny was a legend in the field of sabotage, but they all fell victim to Soviet deception. It was a blow to the prestige of the German special services and proof of the intellectual superiority of the Soviet side. After the war, when the truth came out, many Western experts recognized Berezino as a masterpiece of intelligence, worthy of study and emulation. The influence of the operation extended far beyond World War II. The methods developed in Berezino were used by Soviet intelligence in the subsequent decades of the Cold War. Radio games as a tool for disinformation against the enemy. The recruitment and use of captured enemy agents. The creation of multi-level legends. and the maintenance of long-term operations. All these techniques were refined and applied in the fight against the special services of the United States, Great Britain, and other NATO countries. The experience of Berezino was passed down from generation to generation of Soviet and Russian intelligence officers, becoming part of their professional culture. The history of the operation also entered popular culture. After the information about it was declassified, books were written, documentaries were made, and works of art were created. The image of Lieutenant Colonel Scherhorn and his non-existent unit became a popular subject. People admired the audacity of the plan, the skill of its execution, and the drama of the situation. Operation Berezino became one of the symbols of the Great Patriotic War. A war not only on the battlefield but also in the fields of intelligence, disinformation, and psychological confrontation. It showed that victory is achieved not only by force of arms, but also by force of mind. To understand the scale of the operation, it is useful to compare it with other well-known radio games of the time. The British Operation Double Cross, during which all German agents in Great Britain were captured and recruited, lasted throughout the war and is considered one of the greatest achievements of British counterintelligence. Operation Minomoth, carried out by Soviet intelligence in 1942-1943, was also extremely successful. But Berezino stands out for its concentration in time, clarity of purpose, and measurability of results. In 9 months, it achieved what other operations had taken years to accomplish. It is important to note the human factor of the operation. Behind its success were specific individuals: Pavel Sudoplatov, Naum Eitingon, Alexander Demyanov, Mikhail Makliarsky, William Fisher, and many others. Each of them risked their careers and, in some cases, their lives. Each made their own unique contribution. Sudoplatov provided strategic leadership and protection at the highest level. Eitingon brilliantly coordinated all the details on the ground. Demyanov played the deadly, dangerous role of a double agent. Makliarsky created convincing legends and scenarios. Fisher handled the technical side of radio communications. It was a team effort by top-notch professionals. Operation Berezino ended with the war, but its legacy lives on. It remains a subject of study in intelligence schools around the world. Historians analyze it, and researchers write about it. Each new generation finds something of its own in this story. Some admire the ingenuity, some study the psychological aspects, and some analyze the technical details. But they all agree on one thing: it was a masterpiece of intelligence, worthy of memory and respect. The story of Lieutenant Colonel Scherhorn's non-existent unit became a real part of the history of the Great Patriotic War, a war that was fought not only on the front lines, but also in the minds of the enemies. And in this war of wits, Soviet intelligence won a brilliant victory.